its announcement in 2020, the gaming community immediately latched onto Stray. It was all over my TikTok feed, all over Twitter, and all over every waking second of consciousness I had until its release in the summer of 2022. Stray sounded like my perfect gaming experience. Play as a cat, run around and do tasks, scratch up some carpets. I literally wanted nothing more. But Stray did something for me apart from just the main concept of, playing as a cat that really, really made me love this game. It effectively and it beautifully told a story. And that is what I want to talk about today. Stray was a debut production for Blue 12 Studio, and it was published by Annapurna Interactive, who you might have heard of. They've published a lot of great titles, and they're very, very big in the indie gaming community. In this game, you play as a stray cat who's been separated from his family after falling into a pit that turns out to be a walled-off city. You're chased down by Zurks, which are these weird, mutant bug things that will kill you and will eat you and are very unforgiving. It just won Best Debut Indie, I believe, at the Game Awards, among several other awards that night. And I think it was a very well-deserved win, because not only did I feel like this game was at the level of a AAA release already for a literal debut indie studio, but I think it serves as a perfect example of how to tell a story through a video game, or really through any sort of visual medium. If you've ever taken any sort of English or literature class, the elements of a story are probably not too unfamiliar to you. The characters, the plot, the setting, the conflict, the resolution, all of those go into making something an actual legitimate narrative. On top of all of that, however, a good story has undertones to it that push it further without overpowering the big main elements of a story, and without making it feel too heavy-handed. So how does Stray answer all of this? And why is somebody sitting down in front of a camera and making a video about this game? Off the bat, the setting of the game isn't something very unique in the gaming world so far. It's very, very cyberpunk, and we've had a lot of cyberpunk releases lately, especially ones that have all these really compact towns and all of these neon lights and everything that makes something look cyberpunk. But I think part of what does make it so unique and what I really love is the plot, the story, obviously. It's not something super different, but it does have those subtle undertones and these callbacks to other things that push it further and push the envelope of what it is. But it's not super overt. Okay, spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about the plot a little bit. Plot essentially follows you playing the cat as you're trying to escape this walled city you've fallen into. Conflict sort of comes in the forms of the Zurks that are trying to chase you down and kill you, and also, kill the robots as well. And also comes in restoring the memories of your companion, your little robot buddy, B12. Basically, restoring his memories is part of the way to get you out.
Something I think that's important to note, and where the plot and setting meet with the support from these subtle undertones that make up a good story I mentioned earlier, is the resemblance to an actual democratic uprising in an actual city. If you didn't know, the working title for Stray was HK Project, referencing Hong Kong. The developers of Stray had a strong interest in that situation and wanted to pay their respects through this game, which is used as a beautiful foundation to create such a good story. Even the city you fall into in the game is based off a real-life city that once existed in China, Kowloon Walled City.
Another thing I really love about this game, and that I think conveys this story so well, is the perspective. Obviously, I've already kind of mentioned, and you should know by now, you play as a cat. And I don't think that's, great just because it's a cat and it's cool, It's the fact that, with animals, there's this like innocent understanding about the world, kind of the same way with like kids. When you play as kids in games, they see things differently than grown adults are going to. A lot of what it reminds me of, and this also is probably going to be a little bit of a stretch, but one of my favorite films, The Florida Project. If you haven't seen it before, essentially, what matters here is the fact that it's told through the eyes of a child. The cinematographers in this film constructed shots where it's literally like at eye height of a child. So you're seeing things the way a child is going to. And that really brings a completely unique take on films and on, the relationships and the plot lines of this film. And there's a lot of dark stuff that goes on in the Florida Project. More context about it. It's basically about a family in poverty in Florida, living in the shadows of Disney World. And when you're watching this film, there's a lot of things that are, hidden to the child that we understand what is going on once you think about it. There are things that the kid doesn't see that, they're behind closed doors or they're out of their sight. And then you're like, oh, I know what's going on. The kid doesn't. And that's really sad, kind of thing. That's why it's one of my favorite films, because it did something so different and so heart-wrenching. And it was able to achieve that through that unique perspective and the unique way of telling a story. And I think Stray was really able to do that too. I did want to talk about some of the cons that I heard about this game. And this video isn't really like a pro-con of why you should play it, but there are things that people I saw mention that to me, I don't think detract from it as a story, or I think build it up as a story more. So I do think it is important to address them. So if you couldn't tell from how I've already talked about it, this is still a very guided narrative game. There's a limit to what you can do and when, and I believe the developers wanted to do that to keep it from becoming mainly a cat simulator game. However, it doesn't constrict you enough that you can't soak in the environment of the game. They still allow for breaks in the story or chances to find extra bits and pieces of information that help build the world more.
One of my other favorite elements to the game is your ability in certain areas to take naps. I think this allowed for a very enjoyable pause in the game that let you not only take in the environment, but everything you've learned thus far, which I think is a great thing for games to do and is good for telling a great and enjoyable story.
There's also little side quests you can do if you're a completionist. There's other little tasks and achievements you can get if you kind of go off the path a little bit. Along with that, like I said, you can scratch up carpets, you can mess up board games, you can trip robots. You can do anything that a cat would do to cause chaos. However, you can't do it with everything. It is still a little bit limited. Now, the people I saw in like Steam reviews talking about that, I really think they were looking for something to criticize, because to me, I didn't notice that. Like, I wasn't, every place I went to look that I was like, oh, this looks like something I could interact with, I was interacting with it. And the areas where I wasn't going and looking for things to interact with, there wasn't stuff to interact with there. It wasn't something that, like, really, to me, stuck out as an issue. And one of the other things they talk about that is kind of a constraint is the ability to jump. You can't just do it freely. You have to be going up to a ledge or moving to a higher space, something like that. Jumping up or down in a like pre-made location. You can't just freely do it. I don't personally think it's too much of an issue. I get that, with any sort of narrative game, things like that, that is something you can do. But, I mean, I don't know how often my cats themselves just, like, randomly jump in place. It just isn't a detractor. in my eyes. It doesn't take away from the story. It doesn't take away from how beautiful this game is. Enough for me to, really think that that's something that is impactful. And again, like I mentioned, I believe the developers didn't want to fall too much into having a simulator. They really wanted to tell the story from the perspective of a cat, but they didn't want it to be completely free range. And I think that is perfectly fine. I mean, narrative games before, it's sort of the same thing. You can't always, do certain actions all the time. Sometimes you can only do things as irrelevant to the story. I don't think that detracts at all, especially when we're talking about how this game is a perfect example of how to tell a good story. That is not something that detracts from it. If you're looking to try and tell a story, if you're looking to try and make a game, Stray is a great example of how to do it. Especially, all the reasons I've mentioned, obviously, but especially how to make something stand out and be unique. I don't think that this game would have hit as hard as it did for me, or for all of the other people who have played it, if the protagonist wasn't a cat. And that's not to say that it's a terrible game without that, but it got it so much attention in the beginning, it hooked people in, and then it grew from there. And I think that's another thing that a great story does. You can't reel a fish in and then just stop and let go of your energy, let go of your hold. Fish is just going to swim away. You gotta hook it in, reel it in, keep reeling until you get it and you can yank it up and it's yours. I have not fished before, so I don't know if that makes sense. But it's literally the reason when you're writing an essay or a story or whatever, you have a hook. You have that opening sentence that brings people in. I think the perspective of this game was really the hook, but the story was really there. And it didn't just have these two elements that weren't fitting together. They blended very, very well, and the developers made sure to do that. So yeah.